Hey there, truth seekers. Today we're diving into a mystery that makes Atlantis look like a neighborhood swimming pool. I'm talking about Mu, the mother of all lost continents, a supposed massive landmass that allegedly stretched across the Pacific Ocean before vanishing beneath the waves about 12,000 years ago. And here's the kicker. According to some researchers, this wasn't just any ancient civilization. We're talking about the original human homeland, complete with advanced technology, cosmic knowledge, and possibly, just possibly, a little help from beings not exactly from around here. Yeah, we're going there. Now, before the skeptics in the comments start typing pseudoscience, hear me out. We're looking at strange genetic markers in human DNA that scientists can't quite explain. Ancient maps showing land where there should only be ocean, and megalithic structures scattered across the Pacific that share the same architectural fingerprints. Add in oral traditions from dozens of indigenous cultures, all pointing to the same sunken paradise, and suddenly this myth starts feeling a bit more solid. Whether Mu was real or the greatest collective false memory in human history, the evidence, or lack thereof, makes for one fascinating rabbit hole. So here's the deal. Smash that like button if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about human origins, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how global this truth-seeking community really is. Fair warning, by the end of this video, you'll either be convinced that mainstream archaeology is missing a massive piece of the puzzle, or you'll have a list of perfectly the Pacific. Either way, it's going to be a wild ride. Let's get into it. Now let's start with something that'll make you question everything your high school biology teacher ever told you: your DNA. That's right. The microscopic instruction manual that supposedly explains exactly where you came from and how you got here. Except here's the thing. Modern geneticists keep stumbling across sections of the human genome that make absolutely no sense according to conventional evolutionary theory. We're talking about genetic markers that just appeared in human DNA roughly 12,000 years ago, which, if you're keeping track, is exactly when the continent of Mu supposedly took its final bow and sank beneath the Pacific. Coincidence? Maybe. But when geneticists start using words like anomalous and unexplained insertion in their research papers, you know something interesting is going on. These genetic peculiarities aren't just random mutations that popped up because ancient humans ate too many fermented berries. We're talking about organized sequences, specific markers that seem almost deliberately placed in our genome. Some researchers, the ones brave enough to risk their academic reputations, suggest that around 12,000 years ago, something or someone tinkered with human DNA. Now, before you accuse me of going full ancient aliens on you, understand that this isn't about little green men necessarily. It could be genetic engineering from an advanced human civilization. It could be natural mutations we don't understand yet. Or, yes, it could be something more exotic. The point is, the standard "humans slowly evolved over millions of years with no surprises" narrative has some serious holes in it, and those holes are written in our genetic code. What makes this particularly fascinating is the timing. 12,000 years ago sits right at the boundary of what geologists call the Younger Dryas period, basically when the last ice age decided to throw one final tantrum before exiting stage left. It's also when, according to oral traditions from literally dozens of cultures, some major catastrophe reshaped the world. And it's precisely when Mu allegedly went from thriving Pacific superpower to underwater real estate. So either we're dealing with the most elaborate coincidence in human history, or there's actually something to this whole lost mother civilization theory. The genetic evidence, at the very least, suggests that something significant happened to humanity during this period, and whatever it was left a permanent signature in our DNA. Think about it this way. If you were running a 23andMe test on yourself, expecting to find out you're 30% Irish and 15% Italian, and instead the results came back saying, unknown origin, does not match any existing population group, you'd probably have questions. Well, that's essentially what some geneticists are finding when they dig deep enough into certain segments of human DNA. There are sequences that don't have clear ancestral lineages, chunks of genetic code that seem to just appear in the human genome, without the usual evolutionary breadcrumbs leading back to earlier hominids. It's like finding a chapter in the middle of a book that's written in a completely different language and inserted by a different author. Naturally, mainstream science has explanations for this: contamination, unidentified ancient population groups, computational errors in sequencing. But the problem is, these anomalies keep showing up in study after study, and they all cluster around that same 12,000-year time frame. The idea that our DNA might contain memory of a forgotten civilization sounds like something out of a science fiction novel. But here's where it gets wild. Genetic information is incredibly stable and can preserve evidence of population movements, interbreeding events, and even environmental pressures from tens of thousands of years ago. So if there was indeed an advanced civilization that either genetically modified early humans or simply interbred with more primitive populations, that evidence would absolutely still be visible in modern human genomes. We're essentially walking around with potential proof of Mu encoded in every cell of our bodies. Unfortunately, extracting that proof and convincing the academic establishment that it means what you think it means are two very different challenges. It's a bit like trying to explain to your parents that, yes, you do need to spend 8 hours a day playing video games because it's actually a viable career path. Technically true, but good luck with that conversation. Now, let's talk about what the actual people of the Pacific have been saying for thousands of years, long before any geneticists started poking around in DNA sequences. If you want evidence of Mu, you don't necessarily need a laboratory. Sometimes, you just need to listen to the stories. Indigenous peoples across the Pacific Ocean, from Polynesia to Melanesia to the scattered islands in between, have maintained oral traditions about a great ancestral homeland that sank beneath the waves. These aren't vague, once-upon-a-time fairy tales either. We're talking about detailed accounts with specific names, geographic descriptions, and consistent narrative elements that appear in cultures separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. Take the Maori people of New Zealand, for instance. Their legends speak of Hawaii, not to be confused with Hawaii, the state, though interestingly the names are related. Hawaii, in Maori tradition, is the original homeland, the place where their ancestors came from before undertaking the Great Migration across the Pacific. It's described as a land of abundance, advanced knowledge, and spiritual power. When someone dies in Maori tradition, their spirit returns to Hawaii. This isn't just a metaphorical heaven. It's talked about as a real geographic location that once existed but is no longer accessible. Now, the mainstream anthropological explanation is that Hawaii refers to some island in central Polynesia that the Maori migrated from. But here's the thing. Similar stories exist across dozens of Pacific cultures, all describing a homeland that's no longer there, and all using remarkably similar names. Hawaiian oral traditions mention kahiki, which is essentially the same word as Hawaii, just with a slight pronunciation difference. Again, we have stories of ancestors coming from this distant homeland, bringing with them knowledge of navigation, agriculture, and social organization. The people of Rapa Nui, that's Easter Island for those of you who prefer the colonial name, have legends of Hiva, their ancestral land. Are you seeing the pattern here? Hawaii, kahiki, Hiva. These are phonetically related words used by cultures that had no contact with each other for potentially thousands of years, all referring to a lost homeland. Either we're dealing with the most remarkable linguistic coincidence in human history, or these scattered populations are all remembering the same place. What makes these oral traditions particularly compelling is the consistency of details. These stories don't just say, "we came from somewhere else." They describe a land with specific characteristics: advanced civilization, divine or semi-divine rulers, catastrophic destruction, and subsequent diaspora. The legends speak of ancestors who possessed knowledge far exceeding what you'd expect from Stone Age island populations. Advanced astronomy, sophisticated navigation techniques, complex architecture. These weren't primitive people telling campfire stories about a magical land of plenty. These were navigators who could cross thousands of miles of open ocean using only the stars, currents, and wave patterns. And they were insisting that their ancestors came from somewhere even more advanced. Anthropologists are finally starting to take these oral traditions seriously, instead of dismissing them as mythology. Turns out that when dozens of isolated cultures all tell basically the same story, maybe, just maybe, there's some historical truth buried in there. It's a bit like if people all over Europe independently came up with legends about a massive empire that built roads, aqueducts, and conquered most of the continent. And then archaeologists discovered, oh wait, that's just Rome. It actually existed. Sometimes myths are just history with a few thousand years of telephone game played on them. The interesting part is what these stories say about the end of this ancestral homeland. Almost universally, Pacific oral traditions describe a catastrophic event: earthquakes, tsunamis, the land sinking beneath the sea, or sometimes a combination of all three. This isn't a peaceful, "we decided to move" narrative. This is, "our homeland was destroyed and we fled for our lives" stuff. The survivors scattered across the Pacific, bringing fragments of their civilization's knowledge to whatever islands they could reach. In many traditions, these refugees became the culture heroes, or civilizing gods, of the local populations. The ones who taught primitive tribes how to build, farm, navigate, and organize society. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but oral traditions can be unreliable. People exaggerate, details get distorted over generations. Maybe they're just remembering a really bad storm that flooded their island. Fair point. Oral history is notoriously tricky to verify. But here's what makes the Pacific traditions different: the sheer geographic spread and the consistency of the core narrative. We're talking about cultures separated by distances equivalent to crossing the entire Atlantic Ocean. Cultures that had no contact with each other for thousands of years, all maintaining versions of the same story. That suggests the original event or place was significant enough and traumatic enough to be passed down with remarkable accuracy through countless generations. Plus, these aren't just random tribes with loose storytelling traditions. Polynesian cultures in particular had extremely sophisticated methods for preserving oral history. We're talking about trained specialists, people whose entire job was to memorize and recite genealogies, legends, and historical accounts with perfect accuracy. This wasn't your uncle retelling that time he almost caught a really big fish and the story getting bigger each year. This was a rigorous system of knowledge transmission that rivals written records in its accuracy. When a Polynesian master navigator tells you his ancestors came from Hawaii and describes the route they took, he's reciting information that's been carefully preserved for potentially hundreds of generations. The really fascinating part comes when you start mapping these traditions against what we know about Pacific migration patterns from archaeology and genetics. For a long time, the academic consensus was that Polynesians originated from Taiwan, migrated through the Philippines and Indonesia, then spread across the Pacific from west to east over several thousand years. That's the out-of-Taiwan model, and it's got decent archaeological support. But here's where it gets interesting. Genetic studies keep finding weird anomalies, connections between Polynesian populations and South American populations that shouldn't exist according to the standard model, DNA markers that suggest much older settlement dates than we thought possible, and evidence of population movements that don't fit the neat west-to-east pattern. What if the oral traditions are actually more accurate than our archaeological models? What if there really was a central homeland in the middle of the Pacific that populations radiated out from? That would explain why cultures from New Zealand to Easter Island to Hawaii all maintain legends of a common origin point. It would explain the linguistic similarity. It would explain why these supposedly isolated populations all share certain cultural practices, architectural techniques, and astronomical knowledge. The standard model has Polynesians island hopping across the Pacific like they're playing a very slow game of hopscotch. But what if they actually originated from a central location, Mu, and then scattered in all directions after it was destroyed? Look, I'm not saying this proves Mu existed as some kind of Pacific Atlantis with crystal towers and flying machines. What I am saying is that when you've got genetic anomalies, oral traditions, and archaeological oddities all pointing to the same time period and the same general area, it's worth considering that maybe something significant actually happened. Maybe there was a large landmass in the Pacific that supported an advanced civilization. Maybe that civilization had a dramatic and catastrophic end around 12,000 years ago. And maybe the survivors carried pieces of that civilization, both genetic and cultural, to every corner of the Pacific and beyond. The blood in our veins and the stories passed down through generations might be the only surviving evidence of humanity's true origin story. Mainstream archaeology can dismiss it, geneticists can call it contamination, and anthropologists can label it mythology, but the evidence keeps piling up. Unexplained genetic markers that appear right at the 12,000-year mark. Oral traditions from dozens of cultures describing the same ancestral homeland and the same cataclysm. Linguistic connections that shouldn't exist if these populations developed in isolation. At some point, you have to stop calling it coincidence and start asking uncomfortable questions about what really happened to humanity at the end of the last ice age. And here's the really uncomfortable thought. If there was an advanced civilization that influenced or engineered human DNA 12,000 years ago, what happened to it? Where did that knowledge go? Why did we have to spend the next 10 millennia slowly reinventing agriculture, architecture, and astronomy if we supposedly inherited all this advanced information? The usual answer is that the catastrophe was so complete that almost everything was lost. with only fragments surviving in oral traditions and possibly in our genetic code. But that raises even more questions. What kind of event could so thoroughly destroy an advanced civilization that barely any physical evidence survived? And if these people were advanced enough to manipulate human genetics, why couldn't they survive whatever cataclysm destroyed their homeland? These are the questions that keep researchers up at night. Well, the researchers who are willing to ask them publicly. Because here's the thing about challenging mainstream academic narratives. It's not exactly great for your career. You can have all the genetic data and oral traditions in the world, but if you stand up at a conference and say, I think there was an advanced civilization in the Pacific 12,000 years ago that influenced human DNA, you're probably not getting invited back next year. It's like showing up to a formal dinner party and announcing that you believe in Bigfoot. Technically, you're allowed to say it, but don't expect anyone to take you seriously afterward. But the evidence doesn't care about academic politics or career preservation. The genetic markers are there, the oral traditions are there, the linguistic connections are there, and they all point to something significant happening in the Pacific region around 12,000 years ago, right when Mu allegedly existed and was destroyed. Whether that something was a continent-sized landmass with an advanced civilization, or just a really significant cultural center that got hit by a tsunami, we're dealing with a gap in human history that desperately needs to be filled. And maybe, just maybe, the answer isn't going to come from digging in the ground or analyzing pottery shards. Maybe it's going to come from listening to the stories that have survived for thousands of years and from reading the genetic code that we all carry inside us. The next time someone tells you that human history is completely understood and there are no mysteries left to solve, remember that we're walking around with unexplained segments in our DNA and that cultures across the Pacific have been trying to tell us about their lost homeland for thousands of years. Sometimes the truth is literally written in our blood, and sometimes it's hiding in plain sight in stories we dismissed as mythology. The question isn't whether something significant happened 12,000 years ago in the Pacific. The evidence suggests that something definitely did. The real question is whether we're ready to accept what that evidence is trying to tell us about who we are and where we really came from. But hey, that's what the rest of this deep dive is for. So we've established that your DNA might be hiding secrets, and that Pacific cultures have been trying to tell us something for thousands of years. But maybe you're still skeptical. Maybe you need something more tangible than genetic markers and oral traditions. Fair enough. Let's talk about rocks. Specifically, let's talk about the massive, inexplicable stone structures scattered across the Pacific that mainstream archaeology would really prefer we didn't ask too many questions about. Picture this. You're standing on a remote island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and surrounding you are hundreds of multi-ton stone statues staring inland with those hauntingly blank expressions. We're talking about the Moai of Easter Island, naturally. Now, the official story is that the Rapa Nui people carved these behemoths sometime between 1250 and 1500 CE using stone tools, then somehow transported them across the island and erected them on platforms. All of this on an island with virtually no trees, no metal, and a population that supposedly never exceeded a few thousand people. It's a bit like saying a small town in Montana decided to build Mount Rushmore using only pocket knives and pure determination. Technically possible? Maybe. Believable? That's where things get interesting. But here's what makes the Moai even more fascinating in the context of Mu. They're not alone. The architectural techniques, the megalithic construction, the precise stoneworking, these same features show up in structures scattered all across the Pacific. It's like finding the same brand of furniture in houses that are thousands of miles apart, except instead of IKEA, we're talking about massive stone platforms and precisely cut megaliths. The Non-Madal complex in Pohnpei, Micronesia, is a perfect example. This is an artificial archipelago built on a coral reef, consisting of nearly 100 artificial islets constructed from basalt boulders and coral fill. These aren't small rocks we're talking about. Some of the basalt logs used in construction weigh up to 50 tons. The nearest quarry where these boulders came from is on the opposite side of the island. So somehow, the builders had to transport 50-ton rocks across the island, load them onto rafts, float them to the construction site, and then precisely stack them to create walls up to 25 feet high. The official dating puts Non-Madal's construction between 1200 and 1500 CE, which raises some obvious questions about how a relatively small population with Stone Age technology managed this feat. Unfortunately for the mainstream narrative, radiocarbon dating of coral fill and other organic materials keeps suggesting the site might be significantly older than that. Some tests have produced dates going back several thousand years, which the academic establishment promptly dismisses as contamination or misdating. Because obviously, if the dates don't fit the model, the dates must be wrong, not the model. That's just good science, right? Then we have the underwater structures off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan. In 1986, a dive instructor discovered what appeared to be a massive stone formation on the seafloor. Terraced platforms, flat surfaces, right-angle corners, and what looks suspiciously like a carved face or two. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has spent decades studying the site and insists it's a man-made structure that dates back at least 10,000 years, based on when that area would have been above sea level. The mainstream response? It's just natural rock formations that happen to look artificial.
Sure, and the Grand Canyon is just a really committed river that follows a very specific erosion pattern.
Look, I'm not saying every underwater rock formation is a lost city, but when you've got multiple terraced levels, apparent stairways, and stone pillars all in the same location, maybe, just maybe, it's worth considering that humans had something to do with it. What connects all these structures across the Pacific isn't just that they're made of big rocks. Lots of ancient cultures built with big rocks. What's remarkable is the similarity in construction techniques and architectural design. We're talking about the same methods of stone cutting, the same style of megalithic platforms, the same astronomical alignments. It's like discovering that medieval European cathedrals, Japanese pagodas, and Maya pyramids all use the same architectural blueprint. That would suggest some kind of common source, some shared knowledge base that spread across vast distances. In the case of Pacific megaliths, that common source might just be Mu. The stoneworking precision is particularly noteworthy. At many of these sites, we find stones that are cut and fitted together so precisely that you couldn't slip a credit card between them. No mortar, no adhesive, just stone-on-stone contact that survived thousands of years of earthquakes, tsunamis, and general geological mayhem. The Moai platforms on Easter Island demonstrate this technique. The massive stone walls of Nanmadol show similar precision. Even some of the blocks at Yonaguni display what appear to be intentional right angles and flat surfaces that would require deliberate shaping. This isn't the work of people randomly stacking rocks and hoping for the best. This is sophisticated engineering that requires advanced knowledge of stone properties, structural integrity, and probably some techniques we've lost over the millennia. Now, academia's response to all this is basically parallel development. The idea is that humans are clever, and when faced with similar problems, like how to build impressive structures that won't fall down, they independently come up with similar solutions. That's a reasonable argument for things like pottery or agriculture, where the solutions are relatively obvious. But when you're talking about specific architectural signatures appearing across thousands of miles of ocean, in cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, parallel development starts to strain credibility. It's like if people in Iceland, Madagascar, and Chile all independently invented the same 20-letter alphabet, with the same letter shapes and the same grammatical rules. At some point, you have to consider that maybe they got it from the same source. The radiocarbon dating situation is where things get really contentious. When scientists test organic materials associated with these structures, charcoal from fire pits, coral fill, organic deposits in the stone, they occasionally get dates that are way older than the accepted chronology. We're talking dates that push some structures back to 8,000, 10,000, or even 12,000 years ago. Now, the immediate academic response is to dismiss these as contamination, measurement error, or misdating of sediments that settled long after construction. And to be fair, radiocarbon dating isn't perfect. There are legitimate reasons why dates can be incorrect. But when you keep getting dates that cluster around the same time period, around that magic 12,000-year mark when Mu supposedly existed and was destroyed, it becomes harder to dismiss as mere error. What we might be looking at here are the remnants of a once unified architectural tradition that spread across the Pacific. After Mu's destruction, the survivors who scattered to various islands brought with them knowledge of megalithic construction, stoneworking techniques, and architectural principles. Over time, isolated on their respective islands, these populations adapted the techniques to local materials and needs, but the core design language remained similar. It's like how you can see the influence of Roman architecture in buildings across Europe and the Mediterranean. Except in this case, the Rome of the Pacific sank beneath the waves, and we're left trying to reconstruct what it looked like based on the buildings its refugees left behind. But wait, there's more. Let's pivot from rocks to something arguably even more fascinating, languages that shouldn't exist. If you thought the archaeological evidence was puzzling, the linguistic situation is downright bizarre. We're talking about connections between languages that are separated by literally thousands of miles of open ocean. Connections so strong that linguists have been quietly losing their minds trying to explain them away for decades. Start with the Rongo-Rongo script of Easter Island. This is one of the few indigenous writing systems to develop in the Pacific, and it's a complete mystery. The symbols are intricate, clearly systematic, and absolutely nobody can read them anymore. The last person who could read Rongo-Rongo died in the late 19th century, and despite over a century of linguistic analysis, we've barely scratched the surface of decoding it. But here's where it gets weird. Some researchers have noticed structural similarities between Rongo-Rongo and the Indus Valley script from ancient India. These are writing systems separated by half the planet, from cultures that had zero known contact with each other, yet they share certain organizational principles and symbolic patterns. It's like finding that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and Maya glyphs use the same grammatical structure, except even more unlikely given the distances involved. Then there's what some researchers call the Naga Maya language, referenced in certain esoteric tablets and historical accounts. Now, before you roll your eyes, bear with me. The intriguing part isn't whether this language actually existed as described in the tablets, but rather the documented similarities between ancient Pacific languages and various Old World languages that shouldn't have any connection. Linguistic analysis has revealed phonetic parallels, similar-sounding words with similar meanings, popping up in languages from Easter Island to India to Central America. We're talking about core vocabulary words, not modern loanwords that could be explained by recent contact. Sanskrit, for example, that ancient language of India that's the ancestor of most modern Indian languages, shows some bizarre connections to certain Pacific linguistic features. Now, the standard explanation is that Sanskrit and Pacific languages all derive from some common ancestral language spoken tens of thousands of years ago by the original migrants who populated both regions. That's the Proto-Indo-Pacific hypothesis, and it's got some merit. But here's the problem. The similarities we're finding are too specific and too complex to be explained by a shared ancestor from 50,000 years ago. Languages drift apart over time. After tens of thousands of years of separation, you'd expect languages to be completely unrecognizable from their common ancestor. Yet we keep finding these bridges, grammatical structures, phonetic patterns, even conceptual frameworks for organizing thought that suggest a much more recent common source. The linguistic evidence gets even weirder when you look at the geographic distribution of certain language families. Polynesian languages show remarkable consistency across a massive area of the Pacific, despite being separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years of isolation. A Hawaiian speaker and a Maori speaker can actually understand each other to some extent, even though Hawaii and New Zealand are about as far apart as you can get while staying in the Pacific. That's roughly equivalent to a Portuguese speaker and a Romanian speaker understanding each other despite being separated by the entire European continent. Except Polynesians were doing this without writing, books, or any formal mechanism for language. Standardization. The mainstream explanation is that Polynesians spread across the Pacific relatively recently, within the last 3,000 years, which is why their languages haven't diverged much. But that timeline conflicts with archaeological evidence, suggesting much earlier settlement of some Pacific islands, and it doesn't explain the deeper linguistic connections that seem to extend back further in time. What if the reason for this linguistic consistency isn't recent migration, but rather the existence of a prestige language, a lingua franca of the Pacific that continued to influence local languages even after populations became isolated? And what if that prestige language was the language of Mu? Think about how Latin influenced European languages for centuries after the Roman Empire collapsed. Even though people were speaking their own local languages, Latin remained the language of scholarship, religion, and high culture, which meant it continuously influenced how those languages evolved. If Mu was indeed the cultural center of the Pacific before its destruction, its language would have held similar prestige. The refugees and their descendants would have preserved it, used it for important cultural and religious functions, and it would have continued to shape the evolution of local languages for generations. That could explain why we see such strong linguistic connections across the Pacific, even in populations that supposedly developed in isolation. The phonetic patterns are particularly telling. There are certain sound combinations and pronunciation rules that show up in languages across the Pacific that shouldn't exist if these languages developed independently. It's not just that similar words exist, it's that the rules for how sounds combine and transform follow similar patterns. This is deep linguistic structure we're talking about, the kind of thing that takes thousands of years to develop and is incredibly resistant to change. When you find multiple languages sharing this deep structure, it strongly suggests they derive from a common recent source, not from parallel development or ancient migration patterns. Grammatical structures tell a similar story. The way Pacific languages handle verb tenses, the way they structure sentences, the way they express possession or relationship. These grammatical features show patterns that linguists find difficult to explain through the standard models of language. Evolution. Some grammatical constructions are so similar across distant languages that it suggests either direct contact or descent from a very sophisticated common ancestor language. And when you combine this grammatical evidence with the phonetic evidence and the vocabulary connections, you start building a case for a common linguistic source that's much more recent and much more complex than the mainstream allows for. Now, I can already hear the objections. Linguists are going to say, this is cherry-picking data, and these similarities can be explained by chance or by ancient migration patterns we already know about. And sure, some of these connections might be coincidental. Some might be explainable through known historical contact. But when you've got connections spanning from Easter Island to India to various Pacific islands, connections that include vocabulary, phonetics, grammar, and writing systems, and when these connections keep pointing to the same rough time period and geographic region, you have to start asking whether the standard model is actually adequate to explain what we're seeing. The existence of a proto-language, a mother tongue from which multiple language families descended, isn't itself controversial. Linguists generally accept that most modern languages can be traced back to various proto-languages: Proto-Indo-European, Proto-Afro-Asiatic, Proto-Austronesian, and so on. The controversy comes when you suggest that some of these proto-languages might have a more recent common ancestor than previously thought, and that this common ancestor might have been the language of a specific, advanced civilization. Because that's basically suggesting that instead of language developing through slow, natural evolution, there was a point where a sophisticated, standardized language was spreading across vast distances through organized civilization rather than through random migration and drift. If Mu existed as a maritime civilization with trade networks and cultural influence across the Pacific, its language would have spread through these networks. After the catastrophe, fragments of that language would have survived in the vocabularies and grammars of the scattered population. Over time, these fragments would have evolved into the distinct languages we see today, but the underlying connections would remain visible to anyone looking closely enough. It's like how Romance languages all preserve elements of Latin, even though they've diverged significantly over 2 millennia. The linguistic evidence doesn't prove Mu existed, but it strongly suggests that something unified the Pacific linguistically at some point in the past, and that something was sophisticated enough to leave a permanent imprint on how millions of people communicate to this day. The stone structures and the linguistic connections are two sides of the same coin. Both point to a common source, a unified civilization that spread its knowledge and culture across the Pacific before disappearing. The rocks tell us these people had sophisticated engineering and architectural knowledge. The languages tell us they had complex communication systems and cultural concepts that they transmitted across vast distances. Together, they paint a picture of a civilization that was far more advanced and far more widespread than mainstream archaeology wants to acknowledge. And the uncomfortable question hanging over all of this is, if these people existed, where did they come from, and what happened to them? The answer, according to the theory, is that they came from Mu, and what happened to them was the single greatest catastrophe in human history, the sinking of an entire continent beneath the Pacific waves. But we're just getting started. The stones and languages are evidence, but they're just the beginning. Wait until you hear about the maps that show land where there should only be ocean, or the technology that supposedly primitive people somehow possessed. The rabbit hole goes much deeper than a few statues and similar-sounding words. Trust me on this one. Speaking of things that shouldn't exist, let's talk about maps. Specifically, ancient maps that show land masses in the Pacific Ocean where modern cartography insists there should only be water. This is where the Mu theory gets really interesting, because we're not just talking about oral traditions or ambiguous archaeological sites anymore. We're talking about actual documents, drawn by people who apparently knew something about Pacific geography that we've supposedly forgotten. The Piri Reis map is probably the most famous example, though it's more relevant to Antarctica than the Pacific. But the principle is the same. Ancient maps showing detailed geographic features that shouldn't have been known at the time they were drawn. For the Pacific, we've got the Orientius-Phineas map from 1531, which shows a massive southern continent with surprising detail. Now, the standard explanation is that this is just speculative cartography. Medieval mapmakers filling in blank spaces with imaginary land because they couldn't stand the idea of all that empty ocean. Which is a perfectly reasonable explanation, except for one problem. Some of these imaginary features correspond remarkably well with actual underwater topography that we only discovered with modern sonar technology. Think about it this way. You're a 16th century cartographer working in Europe. You've got access to various ancient sources, some dating back to classical antiquity, and these sources mention or show land masses in regions that contemporary explorers haven't thoroughly mapped yet. Do you just make stuff up, or are you copying from even older maps that might contain information from a time when those land masses were actually visible? The argument for the latter is that these ancient maps show details, coastlines, inland features, relative positions, that are too accurate to be pure invention. It's like if someone in medieval times drew a detailed map of the Americas with the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River, and the Rocky Mountains all in roughly the correct positions, centuries before European exploration. You'd have to ask where they got that information. Bathymetric studies, that's the fancy term for mapping the ocean floor, have revealed some fascinating features in the Pacific. We're talking about underwater plateaus, ridges, and what appear to be submerged mountain ranges. Some of these features are deep underwater now, but during the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower, portions of them could have been above water. We're talking about a drop in sea level of roughly 400 feet at the peak of the last glaciation. That's enough to expose substantial areas that are now submerged. So when people talk about a lost continent of Mu, they might not be talking about a continent in the modern sense, something the size of Australia or Antarctica. They might be talking about a series of large islands, plateaus, and land bridges that together formed a substantial landmass, something large enough to support a significant population and advanced civilization. Computer modeling of late Ice Age geography has produced some intriguing results. When you reconstruct sea levels as they were 12,000 years ago and map out which currently submerged areas would have been above water, you get a Pacific that looks significantly different from today. There are land masses extending from the Hawaiian Islands southward, underwater ridges that could have formed island chains or even continuous land bridges, and substantial areas in the Central Pacific that would have been exposed. Now, does this prove the existence of a continent called Mu? Not exactly, but it does show that the Pacific wasn't just a vast, empty ocean during this period. There was significantly more land above water, and that land could have supported human populations. The geology of the Pacific is particularly relevant here because we're talking about one of the most tectonically active regions on Earth. The Pacific Ring of Fire isn't just a cool name. It's a zone of intense volcanic and seismic activity that's been reshaping the region for millions of years. The theory of plate tectonics tells us that the Pacific Plate is constantly being pushed under surrounding plates in a process called subduction. This creates earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and over long periods, the sinking of land masses. So the idea that substantial areas of land could have been submerged relatively quickly isn't geologically implausible. In fact, it's exactly the kind of thing that happens in subduction zones. The question isn't whether land can sink in the Pacific. It absolutely can and does. But whether a large enough area sank quickly enough around 12,000 years ago to match the Mu legend. Geological data from this period shows significant tectonic activity. The transition from the last ice age to the current interglacial period wasn't a gentle, gradual process. It was marked by rapid changes in sea level, intense volcanic activity, and major earthquake sequences. There's evidence of massive underwater landslides, sudden changes in ocean floor elevation, and catastrophic flooding events as ice sheets melted and sea levels rose. If you were living on low-lying land in the Pacific during this period, your real estate situation could have deteriorated very quickly. We're not talking about a slow, multi-generational process where people could casually relocate. We're talking about the kind of rapid change where you go to bed on solid ground and wake up to find your neighborhood is now a lake. Unfortunately, for anyone trying to build a civilization, natural disasters don't usually wait for you to finish your evacuation plan. The combination of rising sea levels from melting ice sheets and tectonic subsidence from plate movements could have created exactly the scenario described in Mu legends, a rapid, catastrophic submersion of significant land areas. From a survivor's perspective, it would have seemed like the land was sinking into the ocean, which is essentially accurate. The fact that this all happened around 12,000 years ago right at the boundary between the Ice Age and our current climate period, makes it particularly relevant. This was a time of dramatic global change, and the Pacific region would have been especially affected given its tectonic instability. Now let's shift gears and talk about something even more puzzling: the technology. Because if Mu existed as an advanced civilization, they left behind evidence not just in stones and stories, but in artifacts and achievements that frankly shouldn't exist according to our understanding of technological development. We're talking about precision engineering, astronomical knowledge, and understanding of physical principles that supposedly primitive people had no business knowing. Start with stoneworking. We've already mentioned the precision cutting and fitting of megalithic structures, but let's really dig into what this means. Modern stonemasons, using metal tools and mechanical equipment, find it challenging to replicate the precision we see in ancient Pacific structures. These ancient builders were supposedly working with stone tools, literally rocks shaping other rocks, and yet they achieved tolerances that we'd associate with machine tools. We're talking about surfaces that are flat to within fractions of an inch across spans of several feet, corners that are perfectly square, and stones fitted together so tightly that the joints are nearly invisible. This isn't just good enough construction. This is precision engineering that demonstrates a deep understanding of stone properties, structural mechanics, and probably some techniques we haven't figured out yet. The mainstream explanation is patience and skill, that ancient people had lots of time and developed incredible craftsmanship through trial and error, which is partially true, but doesn't fully explain the consistency and scale of what we're seeing. It's one thing to imagine a master craftsman spending years perfecting a single piece. It's another thing to imagine an entire civilization maintaining this level of precision across hundreds of structures over an extended period. That suggests systematic knowledge, formal training systems, and probably some technological assistance we don't understand yet. It's a bit like finding out that medieval monks were hand-copying manuscripts with such precision that every letter was identical across thousands of pages. Sure, humans are capable of amazing things with enough practice, but at some point you have to wonder if they had some kind of tool or technique that made the job easier. Then there's the astronomical knowledge. Ancient structures across the Pacific are aligned with celestial events with a precision that's frankly ridiculous. We're talking about alignments to solstices, equinoxes, and specific stellar positions that require not just casual skywatching, but detailed mathematical calculations. Some structures track the precession of the equinoxes. That's the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes about 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. To track precession, you need multi-generational observational records and the mathematical sophistication to recognize the pattern. This isn't, hey, the sun rises over that mountain on the longest day of the year, level of astronomy. This is, we've tracked and calculated the movement of the celestial sphere over thousands of years level of astronomy. The accuracy of some of these astronomical alignments rivals what we can achieve with modern computers and precise instruments. Structures on various Pacific islands are aligned to celestial events that occurred specifically in the period around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, based on where certain stars were positioned at that time. This suggests either that the structures date from that period, which conflicts with mainstream dating, or that the builders had detailed knowledge of historical star positions and deliberately aligned their structures to commemorate those ancient skies. Either option is problematic for the standard narrative of gradual technological development. Some researchers have suggested that Mu possessed knowledge of electromagnetism and resonant frequencies. This sounds wild until you start looking at the acoustic properties of certain ancient structures. Some Pacific megalithic sites display unusual acoustic characteristics, specific frequencies that are amplified, standing waves that form in certain chambers, resonance patterns that suggest deliberate design rather than accidental features. There are chambers in some structures that focus sound in ways that require sophisticated understanding of wave behavior and acoustic principles. This isn't just, we built a room and it happens to have good acoustics. This is, we built a room specifically to produce these acoustic effects, and we knew exactly what we were doing. The theory extends to electromagnetic effects as well. Some researchers have measured anomalous electromagnetic fields around certain structures, low-frequency signals that don't have obvious natural sources, and what appear to be deliberate alignments of structures along lines of geomagnetic force. Now, to be clear, a lot of this research is controversial and not widely accepted in mainstream science. But the basic observation, that some ancient structures seem to interact with electromagnetic and acoustic phenomena in ways that suggest intentional design, is difficult to dismiss entirely. It's like discovering that medieval cathedrals were built with specific acoustic properties that enhance organ music and choral singing. Oh wait, they actually were. Turns out, ancient people could be surprisingly sophisticated about physics when they wanted to be. The crystal technology theory is where things get really speculative, but bear with me because there's actually some interesting science here. Crystals have unusual properties. They can generate electrical charges when subjected to pressure. They can vibrate at specific frequencies, and they can store and transmit energy in ways that we're only beginning to fully understand. Modern technology uses crystals in everything from watches to computers to radio transmitters. The idea that an ancient civilization might have discovered and utilized these properties isn't inherently absurd. In fact, given how much ancient cultures valued certain crystals and gems, it's not impossible that they figured out some practical applications we've forgotten. The speculation is that Mu might have used large crystals or crystalline structures as energy sources or transmission devices, harnessing the natural piezoelectric properties of certain minerals to generate and manipulate electrical current. This sounds like pure science fiction until you remember that quartz crystals can indeed generate electrical charges when compressed, that certain crystal structures can act as resonators and amplifiers, and that we use these properties in modern technology all the time. The question is whether ancient people figured this out, and if they did, how far they took the technology. We're not talking about crystal-powered flying saucers here. We're talking about potentially using crystals as components in systems for storing or transmitting energy, which is actually plausible given known physics. All of this technological evidence challenges what's called the linear development model of civilization. This is the idea that human societies progress in a straight line from primitive to advanced, with each generation building on the knowledge of the previous one. It's a comforting model because it makes sense. Of course technology gets better over time, right? Except history is full of examples of knowledge being lost, civilizations collapsing, and subsequent societies having to rediscover what their ancestors knew. The fall of the Roman Empire led to centuries where Europe forgot how to build aqueducts, make concrete, or maintain large-scale infrastructure. If that can happen with a well-documented civilization that had writing and extensive records, imagine what could be lost in a truly catastrophic collapse like the one that supposedly destroyed Mu. The technological anomalies we see across the Pacific might be remnants of a much more sophisticated knowledge base that was largely lost when Mu was destroyed. The survivors who scattered to various islands brought with them fragments of this knowledge: how to work stone precisely, how to align structures astronomically, how to manipulate natural forces, but without the full educational and technological infrastructure of their lost homeland. Much of the advanced knowledge degraded over time. What we're seeing in the archaeological record might be like finding a modern smartphone in medieval Europe. The locals might figure out that it's made with incredible precision, that it involves materials they don't fully understand, and that it must have been created by people with advanced knowledge, but they'd have no way to replicate it, or fully understand how it works. This idea that human technological development isn't a smooth upward progression, but rather a series of peaks and valleys, with some ancient civilizations achieving heights that were lost and had to be rediscovered, is deeply uncomfortable for mainstream archaeology. It suggests that we might not be the pinnacle of human achievement, that our ancestors might have known things we've forgotten, and that the primitive ancient people narrative might be more myth than reality. Naturally, academics who've built their careers on the linear development model aren't thrilled about evidence that contradicts it. It's a bit like telling someone who just climbed Mount Everest that, actually, people were paragliding to the summit thousands of years ago. Even if it's true, nobody wants to hear it. But the evidence keeps accumulating. Maps showing lands that shouldn't be there. Underwater topography that matches legends of lost continents. Geological data confirming massive tectonic upheavals at exactly the right time period. Stone-working precision that we struggle to replicate with modern tools. Astronomical knowledge that requires centuries of detailed observations and complex mathematics. Acoustic and electromagnetic effects built into structures that suggest understanding of wave physics. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. Something significant happened in the Pacific around 12,000 years ago, and that something involved a level of knowledge and sophistication that doesn't fit our current historical narrative. Whether we call it Mu or give it some other name, or just acknowledge that we're missing a major piece of human history, the point is that our standard story is incomplete, and that's just talking about the physical evidence. Wait until we get into the really weird stuff, like the question of where this knowledge came from in the first place. Alright, so we've established that the people of Mu, if they existed, had some seriously impressive knowledge about engineering, mathematics, and physics. But here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean strap in, because we're about to question everything you thought you knew about ancient astronomy. Because the evidence suggests that whoever built these structures across the Pacific didn't just understand rocks and construction. They understood the cosmos at a level that would make modern astrophysicists jealous. Let's start with the observatories. And I'm not talking about crude stone circles where someone noticed the sun rises in a generally eastern direction. We're talking about structures aligned with celestial events to within fractions of a degree, tracking phenomena that require centuries of continuous observation and mathematical sophistication that supposedly didn't exist until thousands of years later. Ancient sites scattered across the Pacific, from Hawaii to Easter Island to various locations in Micronesia, show astronomical alignments that are frankly absurd given the supposed technological level of their builders. These aren't just solstice markers either, though those are impressive enough. We're talking about alignments to specific stellar events, to the precession of the equinoxes, and to celestial configurations that only occurred in the period between 10,000 and 12,000 BCE. That's right. These structures seem to commemorate or track astronomical events from the exact time period when Mu allegedly existed. It's like finding a medieval cathedral that's specifically aligned to where Jupiter was on a particular day in the year 500 BCE. You'd have to ask how medieval builders even knew about that configuration, let alone cared enough to align their entire building to it. The precession of the equinoxes is particularly significant here, so let me explain what we're dealing with. Earth wobbles on its axis, like a slightly drunk spinning top, which means that over time, the position of the stars relative to the equinoxes shifts. This wobble takes roughly 26,000 years to complete one full cycle, which means it moves about 1 degree every 72 years. This isn't something you notice casually. You need multi-generational astronomical records to detect the pattern. Ancient astronomers supposedly figured this out, which is impressive. But what's really impressive is that some Pacific structures show alignments to stellar positions from specific points in the precessional cycle, dating back to 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Think about what this means. Either the structures themselves date from that period, which would make them among the oldest precisely aligned structures on Earth, or the builders in later periods had detailed knowledge of historical star positions and deliberately encoded that information into their architecture. Neither option fits comfortably with mainstream archaeology's view of gradual technological development. It's like finding that ancient people not only knew about ice ages, but could tell you exactly what the weather was like on a specific Tuesday in 10,000 BCE. The level of knowledge this implies is frankly ridiculous, and "they just got lucky" stops being a convincing explanation after the 10th coincidence. Star maps encoded in megaliths and petroglyphs are another fascinating element. Researchers have identified patterns in rock art and megalithic layouts that seem to represent specific stellar configurations, constellations as they appeared thousands of years ago, not as they appear today due to precession. This is sophisticated astronomy that requires not just looking at the sky and drawing what you see, but understanding that the sky changes over time and deliberately recording historical configurations. It's the difference between taking a photo and making a time-lapse video that spans millennia. The former is easy. The latter requires planning, organization, and a commitment to knowledge preservation that spans many generations. The accuracy of these astronomical alignments is what really gets researchers excited, or frustrated, depending on whether they're trying to prove or disprove the Mu hypothesis. We're talking about alignments that are accurate to fractions of a degree, which means whoever built these structures either had access to precision instruments we don't know about, or they used observational techniques that were incredibly sophisticated. Modern archaeoastronomers, armed with computers and precise measuring equipment, can confirm that yes, these alignments work, and yes, they're tracking real astronomical phenomena. The question is how Stone Age people supposedly did this with nothing but their eyes and some rocks. Now here's where we have to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the spaceship in the sky. Because when you start talking about ancient people having knowledge that seems impossibly advanced, you eventually run into the ancient astronaut theory. This is the idea that various ancient civilizations, including Mu, received their knowledge from extraterrestrial visitors. And look, I know this sounds like the History Channel at 2 a.m., but hear me out, because the theory has more nuance than aliens did everything. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, or paleocontact theory if you want to sound academic about it, suggests that at some point in human prehistory, we had contact with technologically advanced beings from elsewhere. These beings, whether you want to call them aliens, interdimensional travelers, time tourists, or whatever, supposedly shared knowledge with early humans, jump-starting certain civilizations and giving them information they couldn't have discovered on their own. According to this theory, Mu was either founded by these visitors, or it was a human civilization that received significant assistance from them, resulting in a society that was far more advanced than it should have been given the time period. Now, before you close this video and go watch cat videos instead, let's look at what actually exists in terms of evidence. We're not talking about grainy photos of UFOs or stories about being abducted. We're talking about historical texts, legends, and physical evidence that at least raises some interesting questions, even if it doesn't definitively prove anything. The Nakal tablets, which may or may not actually exist depending on who you ask, supposedly describe the rulers of Mu as divine beings, with knowledge far exceeding normal human capabilities. They're described as teachers who came from the heavens and brought with them understanding of astronomy, agriculture, architecture, and basically everything you'd need to bootstrap a civilization from Stone Age primitives to advanced society. The tablets describe these beings as having distinctive physical characteristics and abilities that set them apart from regular humans. Now, the problem is that nobody can actually examine these tablets because they've either been lost, destroyed, or never existed in the first place, which is convenient for believers and frustrating for skeptics, as you might imagine. But let's set aside the questionable tablets and look at something more concrete: skeletal remains. Genetic studies of ancient bones from the Pacific region have revealed some unusual features. We're talking about cranial structures that don't quite match standard human morphology, DNA sequences that show unexpected variations, and physical characteristics that suggest either unknown population groups or some kind of genetic anomaly. Now, mainstream anthropology explains these as variations within the normal range of human diversity, possibly from isolated populations that develop distinctive features. But some researchers point to these anomalies as evidence of hybridization, the interbreeding of normal humans with something else. The something else in ancient astronaut theory would be the extraterrestrial visitor. The idea is that these beings didn't just teach humans, they interbred with them, creating hybrid offspring who would have had unusual physical characteristics and possibly enhanced capabilities. This would explain both the skeletal anomalies and the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge in certain populations. It's essentially the plot of every sci-fi movie where aliens create a hybrid race, except supposedly this happened in real life about 12,000 years ago in the Pacific Ocean. Legends about sky teachers, or heavenly instructors, appear in the mythology of pretty much every culture that claims descent from Mu. We're talking about beings described as coming from the stars, or the sky, possessing vast knowledge, and teaching humans various arts and sciences. The Hawaiian legend of the Menehune describes a race of small, highly skilled builders who predated the Polynesian settlers. Easter Island legends speak of beings with distinctive features who taught the locals how to build the moai. Various Micronesian cultures have stories of teachers from the heavens who brought knowledge of navigation and astronomy. Coincidentally, or not, these stories all describe teachers who came from above, who looked somewhat different from regular humans, and who eventually departed or disappeared. Now, the skeptical explanation for these legends is that they're simply mythologized memories of real human teachers, perhaps refugees from Mu or other destroyed civilizations who seemed godlike to more primitive populations because of their advanced knowledge. The ancient astronaut interpretation is that these legends preserve actual memories of extraterrestrial contact. The truth is probably somewhere in between, or possibly something we haven't even considered yet. But the consistency of these legends across isolated cultures is noteworthy, regardless of how you interpret them. The paleo-contact theory gets really interesting when you start looking at the timing. Around 12,000 years ago, right when Mu supposedly existed and was destroyed, we see what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution starting to spread across the world. Humans are transitioning from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists, building permanent settlements, developing complex social structures, and basically laying the groundwork for civilization. The mainstream explanation is that this happened independently in multiple locations as humans naturally progressed. But the ancient astronaut theory suggests that this revolution was actually the result of knowledge spreading from a central source, possibly Mu, where extraterrestrial visitors had jump-started advanced civilization. Think about it from an alien perspective. If you're visiting a primitive planet and you want to help the locals develop, what do? You pick a location, establish a base or settlement, teach the humans everything they need to know to build a civilization, and then either leave or integrate with the local population. That settlement becomes the most advanced place on the planet. Other humans come, learn, and take that knowledge back to their own regions. Eventually, you've got agricultural and architectural techniques spreading across the globe, all radiating from your initial contact point. In this scenario, Mu would have been that contact point in the Pacific, with knowledge spreading from there to the Americas, Asia, and beyond, before the whole operation got wiped out by a geological catastrophe. The genetic angle is particularly fascinating because it doesn't require you to believe in aliens to acknowledge that something weird is going on. We have documented evidence of unexpected genetic markers in human populations, skeletal anomalies that don't fit standard morphology, and DNA sequences that scientists are still trying to explain. The question is interpretation. Is this evidence of normal human variation that we don't fully understand yet? Or is it evidence of something more exotic? When you combine the genetic anomalies with the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge, the astronomical sophistication, and the consistent legends about sky teachers, you start building a case for something beyond standard human evolution. Even if you're not ready to commit to the aliens did it explanation. Here's the really interesting part. The ancient astronaut theory doesn't actually conflict with the Mu hypothesis. In fact, they complement each other quite well. Mu could have been a human civilization that received extraterrestrial assistance, making it the most advanced society of its time. The astronomical knowledge, the precision engineering, the understanding of physics, all of this could have been taught or demonstrated by visitors who had mastered these sciences. When Mu was destroyed in the catastrophe, the surviving humans scattered across the Pacific and beyond, taking fragments of this knowledge with them. The divine beings, or sky teachers, mentioned in legends could have been either the extraterrestrial visitors themselves or the human elite of Mu who possessed knowledge from these visitors. Now let's be clear about something. The ancient astronaut theory is highly speculative and not accepted by mainstream archaeology or anthropology. There are perfectly reasonable explanations for most of the evidence that don't require extraterrestrial intervention. Humans are creative, intelligent, and capable of impressive achievements even with limited technology. The fact that ancient people figured out complex astronomy, precision engineering, and sophisticated social organization doesn't necessarily mean they had help from space. It might just mean we've been consistently underestimating our ancestors. But, and this is a significant but, the sheer concentration of advanced knowledge in specific locations at specific times does raise questions about how that knowledge originated and spread. The mainstream model of slow, independent development in isolated regions doesn't fully account for the similarities we see across vast distances, the sudden appearance of complex techniques, or the astronomical sophistication that seems to exceed what would be expected from purely observational astronomy. Something accelerated human development in certain locations, and whether that something was extraterrestrial visitors, a now lost advanced human civilization like Mu, or some combination of both, the point is that our standard historical narrative has some gaps that need to be addressed. The astronomical evidence alone is enough to make you wonder. When you've got structures encoding star positions from 12,000 years ago, when you've got alignments to precessional cycles that take 26,000 years to complete, when you've got encoded celestial maps that show understanding of stellar mechanics that we supposedly didn't rediscover until modern times, you have to ask where this knowledge came from. Did isolated island populations independently develop the mathematical and observational skills needed to track precession? Did they maintain consistent multi-generational research programs spanning thousands of years? Or did they inherit this knowledge from someone who already had it figured out, whether that someone was the civilization of Mu or visitors from beyond Earth? The legends of sky teachers might be the key to understanding this. If you strip away the mythological elements and look at the core claims, you've got stories about beings with advanced knowledge arriving, teaching humans, and then departing. This could be aliens, or it could be refugees from a destroyed civilization, or it could be a mythologized memory of natural knowledge transmission between cultures. But the consistency of these stories across isolated populations suggests they're remembering something real, even if the details got distorted over thousands of years of oral transmission. What we're left with is a puzzle where multiple pieces suggest something significant happened in the Pacific region around 12,000 years ago, something that involved advanced astronomical knowledge, sophisticated engineering, and possibly contact with beings, human or otherwise, who possessed information far beyond what Stone Age populations should have had. Whether this was the civilization of Mu receiving help from extraterrestrial visitors, or whether Mu itself was founded by these visitors, or whether we're dealing with a purely human civilization that somehow achieved remarkable things, the point is that we're missing something in our understanding of human history. And that something involves the stars, the Pacific Ocean, and knowledge that humanity supposedly shouldn't have possessed for thousands of years after Mu allegedly sank beneath the waves. The next time you look up at the night sky, remember that our ancestors were looking at the same stars, and apparently understanding them at a level that took us millennia to rediscover. That knowledge didn't come from nowhere, and it didn't develop independently in dozens of isolated locations. It came from somewhere, and that somewhere might just have been a now-lost continent in the Pacific, possibly with assistance from visitors who knew their way around the cosmos a lot better than Stone Age humans should have. But we're not done yet. We still need to talk about what actually destroyed Mu, because understanding where all this knowledge came from is one thing. Understanding how it all got buried under several thousand feet of ocean water is quite another. So we've covered the advanced astronomy, the possible extraterrestrial involvement, and the technological sophistication that ancient Pacific cultures somehow possessed. But here's where things get really wild. And I mean, this sounds like a rejected sci-fi plot wild. Because some researchers believe that pyramids and megalithic structures weren't just impressive buildings or astronomical observatories. They were functional components of a global energy network designed and operated by the civilization of Mu. Yes, you heard that right. We're talking about ancient power plants, wireless energy transmission, and an understanding of Earth's natural energy fields that we're only beginning to rediscover with modern technology. Before you click away thinking this has gone full conspiracy theory, let's look at what researchers have actually documented. We're not talking about wild speculation here. We're talking about measurable electromagnetic phenomena, documented acoustic effects, and geological features that suggest these structures were doing something beyond just sitting there looking. Impressive. Whether that something was intentional energy manipulation or just an accidental byproduct of their construction is the debatable part. But the fact that something unusual is happening at these sites is increasingly difficult to dismiss. Let's start with the concept of telluric currents. These are natural electrical currents that flow through the Earth's crust, following patterns determined by geological structures, mineral deposits, and electromagnetic fields. Modern geologists acknowledge that these currents exist and can be measured. What's interesting is that many ancient megalithic sites, including pyramids, stone circles, and various Pacific structures, are located at points where these telluric currents intersect or are particularly strong. Now, the mainstream explanation is that ancient people chose these locations for religious or practical reasons, perhaps because they could sense something special about the spots. But the alternative explanation is that they deliberately chose these locations because they understood these energy flows and wanted to harness or manipulate them. The theory goes like this. Mu possessed knowledge of Earth's natural energy grid, a network of electromagnetic pathways that crisscross the planet. They built their major structures, pyramids and megalithic complexes, at key nodes in this grid, essentially creating a global network of energy collection and distribution points. The pyramid shape itself isn't just aesthetically pleasing or structurally sound. It's allegedly optimal for focusing and amplifying electromagnetic energy. The specific angles, dimensions, and internal chamber configurations would have been calculated to maximize these effects. Basically, ancient people supposedly figured out how to build structures that could tap into Earth's natural energy fields and use that power for practical purposes. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds suspiciously like every ancient free energy conspiracy theory you've ever encountered on the internet at 3 a.m., and you're not wrong to be skeptical. But here's where it gets interesting. Modern researchers have actually measured unusual effects inside and around pyramid structures. We're talking about documented electromagnetic anomalies, areas of higher or lower radiation than surrounding regions, and consistent patterns of energy flow that don't have obvious natural explanations. Recent experiments inside various pyramidal structures have detected electromagnetic fields that are stronger than background levels and show patterns of variation that suggest they're not random. Ultrasonic frequencies, sound waves above the range of human hearing, have been measured inside certain pyramid chambers, particularly when specific conditions are met. Some structures show what's called piezoelectric effects, where mechanical stress on the stone generates small electrical charges. This is a real, documented phenomenon that occurs in certain crystalline materials, including granite and quartz, which just happen to be the building materials used in many ancient megalithic structures. The piezoelectric angle is particularly fascinating because it's actual science, not speculation. When you apply pressure to certain crystals, they generate a small electrical charge. When you apply an electrical charge to these crystals, they vibrate at specific frequencies. This is why we use quartz crystals in watches and electronics. They're natural oscillators that can regulate timing or generate signals. Now imagine a massive structure built from tons of granite or basalt, materials that contain crystalline components. The weight of the structure itself creates constant pressure on the stones. Temperature changes cause expansion and contraction, generating more pressure. Seismic activity from earthquakes adds additional stress. All of this pressure on crystalline materials could, in theory, generate electrical effects throughout the structure. Whether ancient builders knew about piezoelectricity and deliberately exploited it, or whether they just noticed that certain stones seem to have special properties and built with them, is the question. But the fact remains that these structures are generating measurable electromagnetic effects, and the ancient builders seem to have a preference for materials that would maximize these effects. It's like discovering that medieval cathedrals were built with materials that naturally filter air pollutants. You could argue it was intentional design based on understanding of chemistry, or you could argue they just happened to choose stones that coincidentally had this property. Either way, the effect is real. The global network theory takes this a step further. If Mu did possess knowledge of Earth's energy grid and built structures at key nodes, then these structures wouldn't have been isolated installations. They would have been interconnected components of a larger system. The knowledge of how to build these structures would have spread with Mu's refugees after the catastrophe, which is why we find similar pyramidal and megalithic structures across multiple continents and cultures. The connections between Egyptian pyramids, Central American pyramids, and Pacific megalithic structures might not just be coincidental parallel development. They might all be remnants of a single, integrated system designed by or descended from Mu. Now, what would this network have actually done? The most common theory is wireless energy transmission. The idea is that the pyramid network could collect energy from Earth's natural electromagnetic fields, amplify it, and transmit it wirelessly to wherever it was needed. It's essentially Tesla's vision of wireless power distribution, except supposedly ancient people figured it out first, and then we forgot how to do it. Whether this is actually possible using the technologies and materials available to ancient civilizations is hotly debated. But the fact that Nikola Tesla himself believed wireless power transmission was possible, and spent years trying to develop it, suggests it's not completely absurd as a concept. The harmonic resonance angle is equally intriguing. Everything in the universe vibrates at specific frequencies. Atoms, molecules, larger structures, even planets and stars. When you match these natural frequencies, you can amplify effects, transfer energy, or create various phenomena. This is how opera singers can supposedly shatter wine glasses. They hit the glass's resonant frequency, and the vibrations amplify until the glass can't handle it. The theory is that Mu understood these principles and designed their structures to resonate with Earth's natural frequencies, allowing them to tap into enormous amounts of energy with relatively simple technology. The pyramid shape, the internal chamber dimensions, the choice of materials, all of this would have been carefully calculated to achieve specific resonant frequencies. Whether any of this actually worked as described, or whether we're dealing with confirmation bias and overinterpretation of natural phenomena, is something reasonable people can disagree about. But what's undeniable is that ancient structures show evidence of sophisticated understanding of acoustics, material properties, and possibly electromagnetic phenomena. Whether that understanding translated into functional technology or was just used for religious or ceremonial purposes is the debatable part. But dismissing it all as coincidence or primitive superstition requires ignoring a lot of documented evidence. All right, so we've covered the advanced civilization, the astronomical knowledge, the possible extraterrestrial connections, and the energy network theories. Now comes the hard part, explaining how all of this ended. Because if Mu existed as this incredibly advanced civilization with global reach and sophisticated technology, what happened to it? Why did it disappear so completely that most people today think it's just a myth? The answer, according to the theory and supported by geological evidence, is catastrophe. Not just any catastrophe, but possibly the single most devastating event in human history. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth experienced what geologists call the Younger Dryas Boundary Event. This marks a sudden and dramatic climate shift that interrupted the gradual warming trend at the end of the last ice age. In the space of just a few decades, which is basically instantaneous in geological terms. Global temperatures plummeted, ice sheets that had been melting began to advance again, and the climate went haywire. For a long time, scientists weren't sure what caused this sudden climate reversal. The leading theory was that melting ice sheets disrupted ocean currents, which triggered a feedback loop of cooling. But recent evidence suggests something more catastrophic might have been involved. The current leading hypothesis involves an impact event, either a comet, asteroid, or fragment thereof, striking Earth or exploding in the atmosphere above it. Evidence for this includes a thin layer of sediment found at the Younger Dryas boundary, containing materials that only form under extreme heat and pressure, such as you'd get from an impact event. We're talking about microscopic diamonds, magnetic particles, and other markers of catastrophic heating. This layer has been found at sites across North America, Europe, and increasingly in other parts of the world. It's like a geological signature left by a massive explosion or impact. Now let's be clear about scale here. We're not talking about a localized disaster like a single volcanic eruption or earthquake. We're talking about a global catastrophe that would have affected every continent simultaneously. The impact hypothesis suggests either multiple impacts from a fragmenting comet or a massive airburst event that released energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. The effects would have been immediate and devastating. Shockwaves, thermal radiation, wildfires on a continental scale, followed by climate disruption that lasted for centuries. If Mu existed in the Pacific, particularly if it was built on land that was already relatively low-lying, or on oceanic plateaus that were vulnerable to subsidence, this event would have been absolutely catastrophic. The immediate effects, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, would have destroyed structures and killed populations. But the longer-term effects might have been even worse. The climate disruption that followed would have made agriculture difficult or impossible, food supplies would have collapsed, and any surviving populations would have faced a choice: adapt to radically changed conditions or migrate to more habitable regions. Computer modeling of the impact hypothesis shows how a series of major impacts, or airbursts, could trigger massive earthquakes and tsunamis. We're talking about waves that could reach hundreds of meters in height, traveling across entire ocean basins. If you were living on a Pacific island or coastal settlement, you would have had virtually no warning and no chance of escape. The seismic activity from the impacts could have triggered fault lines throughout the tectonically active Pacific region. In areas where oceanic crust was already being subducted, pushed under continental plates, the additional stress could have caused rapid subsidence of large areas. Land that was above water could have dropped below sea level in a matter of hours or days. The scenario for Mu's last night would have been apocalyptic. Imagine you're a resident of this advanced civilization. Maybe you're an astronomer priest tracking the stars, or an engineer maintaining the energy grid, or just a regular person living your life. Then the sky lights up brighter than day as something massive enters the atmosphere. The heat is intense, like opening an oven door, except it's the entire sky. Then the shockwave hits. Buildings that have stood for centuries collapse instantly. The ground shakes harder and longer than any earthquake in living memory. If you're near the coast, you have minutes, maybe, before the tsunami arrives. A wall of water hundreds of feet high, moving at the speed of a jet aircraft, destroying everything in its path. For those who survived the immediate impact, the nightmare was just beginning. Massive volcanic eruptions triggered by the seismic activity would have filled the sky with ash, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to plummet. The advanced agriculture that fed Mu's population would have failed within a single growing season. The energy network, assuming it existed, would have been destroyed or rendered non-functional. Any survivors would have been scattered across a shattered landscape, cut off from the centralized knowledge and resources that had made their civilization possible. Within a generation, most of what they knew would have been lost, preserved only in fragmented oral traditions and the few physical structures that managed to survive. The cultural memory of this catastrophe is preserved in flood myths found in over 500 cultures worldwide. Every inhabited continent has multiple cultures with stories about a great flood or deluge that destroyed the world, killed most of humanity, and required survivors to start over. The details vary. Sometimes it's divine punishment, sometimes it's just bad luck, sometimes there are boats involved. But the core narrative is remarkably consistent. Mainstream archaeology explains these as memories of local flooding events that got mythologized over time. But the alternative explanation is that these are all memories of the same event, filtered through different cultural lenses and distorted by thousands of years of oral transmission. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis explains not just the physical destruction, but also the archaeological mystery of the gap in human development. For thousands of years before the event, humans were making steady progress, developing tools, art, social organization. Then around 12,000 years ago, there's a disruption. Many large animal species go extinct. Human populations decline dramatically. Evidence of cultural development becomes sparse or disappears entirely in many regions. Then, a few thousand years later, we see the sudden emergence of agricultural civilizations in various parts of the world, often with sophisticated knowledge that seems to appear without clear precursors. This pattern makes sense if there was a global catastrophe that destroyed existing civilizations, followed by survivors slowly rebuilding and spreading their knowledge to less affected regions. In this scenario, Mu would have been one of the primary casualties. Its location in the Pacific, on land that was geologically vulnerable, meant that it bore the full brunt of the catastrophe. The impacts, earthquakes, and tsunamis would have destroyed most physical evidence of the civilization. The subsequent subsidence of large portions of Pacific land would have put whatever remained under thousands of feet of water. The survivors who made it to more stable land, the Hawaiian Islands, Easter Island, various Asian and American coastlines, would have been refugees from a destroyed world, carrying fragments of their civilization's knowledge but lacking the resources and infrastructure to maintain it at its previous level. These refugees become the culture heroes and civilizing gods of later cultures, the beings who taught agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and social organization to supposedly primitive populations. They weren't gods or aliens necessarily. They were survivors of the most advanced civilization of their era, traumatized by catastrophe, and trying to preserve what they could of their culture's legacy. The knowledge they carried, the astronomical observations, the engineering principles, the understanding of natural forces, got incorporated into the cultures they joined, which is why we find these traces of advanced knowledge scattered across multiple cultures with no apparent connection. The energy network, if it existed, would have been among the greatest losses. This wasn't knowledge that could be easily transmitted orally. It required an understanding of electromagnetic phenomena, material properties, and engineering that took generations to develop. Without the educational institutions, the experimental facilities, and the body of accumulated knowledge that Mu possessed, the refugees couldn't reconstruct the technology. They could remember that it existed, could perhaps replicate some of the simpler aspects, but the full, sophisticated system was lost. What remained were the physical structures, the pyramids and megaliths that were sturdy enough to survive the catastrophe, standing as mute testaments to a level of technological achievement that wouldn't be reached again for thousands of years. The geological evidence for this scenario is actually quite strong. We have documented proof of the Younger Dryas climate disruption. We have evidence of impact materials at the appropriate geological layer. We have evidence of massive extinctions, widespread wildfires, and catastrophic flooding. The only thing we can't definitively prove is that a civilization called Mu existed in the Pacific and was destroyed by these events. But when you combine the geological evidence with the archaeological anomalies, the oral traditions, the genetic markers, and all the other pieces we've been discussing, you start building a picture that's at least plausible, even if it's not, accepted by mainstream archaeology. The last night of Mu wasn't a gentle decline or a gradual abandonment. It was violent, sudden, and complete. The most advanced civilization of its era was effectively erased from the earth in a matter of hours, leaving behind only scattered survivors, fragmented memories, and a few structures that were sturdy enough to survive. And here's the uncomfortable thought. If it happened once, it could happen again. The same cosmic threats, the same geological instabilities, the same potential for catastrophic climate disruption, they all still exist. We like to think we're protected by our modern technology and knowledge. But 12,000 years ago, Mu probably thought the same thing. And then one night, the sky lit up, the ground shook, and everything they'd built vanished beneath the waves. Which brings us to the question of what happened to the survivors and whether any of that lost knowledge survived to influence later civilizations. But that's a story for the next section. So the continent sank, the civilization was destroyed, and most of the population was wiped out in what was essentially the worst possible day in human history. But here's the thing about catastrophes. There are always survivors. And these survivors, carrying fragments of Mu's advanced knowledge, scattered across the planet like seeds from a dandelion in a hurricane. Except instead of growing flowers, these seeds grew into the founding myths of multiple civilizations, and possibly jump-started human development in regions that had been relatively primitive up to that point. The refugee theory is actually one of the more compelling aspects of the Mu hypothesis, because it explains several archaeological and mythological mysteries that mainstream history struggles with. We're talking about the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge in various parts of the world, the presence of culture heroes in the founding myths of distant civilizations, and genetic evidence suggesting ancient population movements that don't fit our standard migration models. These refugees, traumatized and desperate, made their way to whatever landmasses they could reach, and in doing so, they became the teachers, the wise men, the semi-divine founders of civilizations that would last for thousands of years. Let's start with Egypt, because ancient Egypt is basically the poster child for how did they know this stuff? In Egyptian mythology, there's a group called the Shemsu Hor, which translates roughly to followers of Horus, or companions of Horus. These beings are described as predating the dynastic period of Egypt. They existed before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before everything we typically associate with Egyptian civilization. According to the legends preserved by various ancient historians, the Shemsu Hor were the ones who brought civilization to Egypt, teaching the locals everything from agriculture to architecture to astronomy. They're described as having come from across the sea, possessing divine knowledge, and establishing the foundations of what would become one of history's greatest civilizations. Now, the mainstream explanation is that the Shemsu Hor are mythological, a way for later Egyptians to explain the origins of their culture by attributing it to semi-divine ancestors. But here's where it gets interesting. The time period when these beings allegedly arrived in Egypt, around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, coincides exactly with the destruction of Mu. And the knowledge they supposedly brought, advanced astronomy, sophisticated architecture, understanding of mathematics, matches the kind of knowledge Mu would have possessed. So either we're dealing with the mother of all coincidences, or the Egyptian legends are preserving actual memories of refugees from a destroyed Pacific civilization who made their way to the Nile Valley and taught the locals everything they knew. The architectural parallels are particularly striking. Egyptian pyramid construction shows techniques that also appear in Pacific megalithic structures: the precise stone cutting, the astronomical alignments, the use of specific materials. The Egyptian knowledge of astronomy was incredibly sophisticated from the very beginning of their civilization, as if it didn't develop gradually, but arrived fully formed. Their understanding of the precessional cycle, their stellar alignments, their complex calendar systems, all of this appears in early dynastic Egypt without clear precursors. It's like if someone today suddenly started building fusion reactors without any prior research into nuclear physics. You'd have to ask where they learned it. Moving east to Mesopotamia, we encounter the Apkallu, sometimes called the Seven Sages. Mesopotamian texts describe these beings as pre-diluvial, meaning they existed before the Great Flood that features prominently in Mesopotamian mythology. The Apkallu were said to be wise men who emerged from the sea and taught humanity the arts of civilization. They instructed people in writing, mathematics, architecture, and the proper worship of the gods. Sound familiar? We're essentially dealing with the same narrative as Egypt. Mysterious teachers from across the sea, arriving after a catastrophe, bringing advanced knowledge to primitive populations. The Mesopotamian legends are particularly explicit about the timing. These teachers arrived after a great flood that destroyed the previous world. The survivors of this flood, according to the texts, preserved what knowledge they could and passed it on to subsequent generations. This is exactly what you'd expect if Mu refugees had made it to Mesopotamia. They'd carry with them memories of the catastrophe that destroyed their homeland, fragments of their civilization's knowledge, and a desperate need to preserve what they could. The locals who encountered them would have seen them as almost godlike. After all, these were people who knew things that no one else in the region knew, who could predict celestial events, who understood building techniques far beyond what local populations had achieved. Now let's hop across the Pacific to the Americas, where we find even more culture hero legends that fit the refugee pattern. In South America, particularly in the Andes region, you have legends of Viracocha, a bearded, godlike figure who arrived from across the sea after a great flood, taught the locals agriculture and civilization, and then departed. In Central America, the Aztecs and other Mesoamerican cultures venerated Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who was similarly described as a bringer of knowledge and civilization, often depicted with features that didn't match the local population. These legends are particularly interesting because they describe the culture heroes as looking different from the local populations, sometimes described as having lighter skin, facial hair, or other features that were uncommon among indigenous Americans. Now, before anyone gets excited about white supremacist interpretations, let's be clear. If these legends have any historical basis, they're probably describing Pacific Islanders or Asian populations, not Europeans. People from Mu would likely have been related to Pacific populations, which have their own distinctive features that might have seemed foreign to early American populations. The point isn't about race. It's about the fact that these teachers were remembered as being visibly different from the people they were teaching, suggesting they came from elsewhere. The timing of cultural development in the Americas also fits the refugee hypothesis. Around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, we start seeing evidence of more sophisticated cultures in various parts of the Americas. Agricultural techniques appear, architectural sophistication increases, and astronomical knowledge becomes evident in various sites. The mainstream explanation is independent development, but the refugee hypothesis offers an alternative. Maybe these advances were jump-started by survivors from Mu who brought their knowledge to American shores. The genetic evidence is where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean mainstream anthropology is having a quiet panic attack trying to explain this. DNA analysis of ancient and modern populations has revealed genetic markers that shouldn't be where they are, according to our standard migration models. We're finding traces of Pacific populations in South America, genetic connections between widely separated populations that suggest contact or migration events we didn't know about, and DNA sequences that indicate more complex population movements than the simple "humans crossed the Bering Strait and spread south" narrative allows for. One of the more remarkable findings is the presence of Polynesian genetic markers in some South American populations. Now, Thor Heyerdahl back in the 1940s tried to prove Pacific to America contact with his Kon-Tiki expedition, but he had the direction backwards. He thought South Americans colonized Polynesia. Modern genetic evidence suggests contact happened, but probably in multiple directions and at multiple times. The point is, there was definitely interaction between Pacific and American populations long before Europeans showed up. If Mu refugees fled both west to the Americas and east to various Pacific islands, you'd expect to find exactly this kind of genetic mixing. There's also genetic evidence of unexplained population movements around the time of the Younger Dryas boundary. Certain genetic markers appear in distant populations at roughly the same time period, suggesting either rapid migration or multiple source populations spreading from a central point. This is exactly what you'd expect if a major civilization was destroyed and its survivors scattered in multiple directions, mixing with local populations wherever they settled. The genetic patterns suggest not just slow, gradual migrations, but rapid, directed movement of people across significant distances. The kind of movement you'd associate with refugees fleeing a disaster. Now let's talk about what modern technology is revealing about the ocean floor, because this is where things get wild. Advanced sonar mapping, submersible archaeology, and satellite imaging have allowed us to survey the Pacific seafloor in unprecedented detail. And what we're finding is both fascinating and frustrating. We're discovering geometric structures on the ocean floor at depths of thousands of meters. Features that look artificial but are so deep that conventional wisdom says they couldn't possibly be man-made, because they've been underwater for millions of years. Except here's the problem with that reasoning: plate tectonics. The Pacific seafloor isn't static, it's constantly being created at mid-ocean ridges and destroyed at subduction zones. Features that are now several thousand meters below the surface might have been at much shallower depths, or even above water in the relatively recent past. The Younger Dryas period involved not just rising sea levels from melting ice, but also significant tectonic activity. Land could have been pushed down, new ocean floor could have been created, and structures that were built on dry land or in shallow water could have ended up at depths that seem impossible for ancient construction. The geometric structures themselves are controversial. Some look like natural geological formations that happen to have regular shape, but some show features, right angles, parallel lines, apparently carved surfaces, that are difficult to explain naturally. The mainstream position is that these are natural formations, and that humans are predisposed to see patterns where none exist. The alternative position is that at least some of these structures are artificial and represent remnants of the civilization that was destroyed when the land subsided. Until someone can actually excavate these features properly, which is extremely difficult at those depths, we're stuck in the realm of intriguing but unproven possibilities. Satellite gravimetry is adding another layer to this mystery. This technology measures tiny variations in Earth's gravitational field, caused by differences in mass distribution below the surface. Oceanographers use it to map seafloor topography without actually having to send ships and sonar across every square mile of ocean. What they're finding in the Pacific are anomalies, areas where the mass distribution doesn't match what you'd expect from natural geological processes. Some of these anomalies are in locations where Mu theoretically would have been. Now, anomalies don't prove artificial structures. They could be unusual mineral deposits, volcanic features, or other natural phenomena. But they do indicate that something weird is going on down there that deserves closer investigation. The Human Genome Project and subsequent genetic research have uncovered their own set of mysteries. There are sections of human DNA, stretches of genetic code, that don't have clear evolutionary origins or functions. Some researchers, in probably the most controversial move possible, have dubbed these segments alien code or junk DNA with structure. Now, before we go full ancient aliens on this, most of these sequences are probably just evolutionary leftovers. Non-coding regions that don't do anything, but also don't hurt anything, so natural selection hasn't removed them. But some researchers argue that certain sequences show patterns that suggest they're not just random accumulation of evolutionary detritus. The timing of certain genetic changes is also puzzling. We've got genetic markers that appear to have entered the human genome around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. There's that date again, and spread relatively quickly through various populations. The mainstream explanation is that these were beneficial mutations that were selected for and spread through normal population mixing. But the refugee hypothesis offers an alternative. Maybe these genetic markers came from the population of Mu, and they spread because Mu refugees intermixed with populations across the globe after their homeland was destroyed. Look, here's the thing about all this evidence. Individually, each piece can be explained away by mainstream science. The culture hero legends are just mythology. The genetic anomalies are sampling errors or misinterpreted data. The underwater structures are natural formations. The gravitational anomalies are geological features. The alien code is evolutionary junk. The refugee theory is just pattern matching and wishful thinking. Fair enough. Science requires skepticism, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But when you step back and look at the whole picture, the geological evidence for a catastrophe 12,000 years ago, the genetic anomalies appearing at exactly that time, the underwater structures in the region where Mu should have been, the culture hero, legends from multiple continents describing teachers from across the sea, the architectural and astronomical knowledge appearing suddenly in various civilizations, the linguistic connections we can't fully explain. At some point, you have to ask whether the accumulation of coincidences is actually telling us something important. The academic establishment remains skeptical, as they should be. Science advances by questioning claims and demanding evidence, not by accepting exciting theories just because they'd make history more interesting. But science also advances by following evidence where it leads, even when it challenges existing paradigms. The evidence for Mu isn't conclusive. There's no smoking gun, no indisputable artifact proving the civilization's existence. But the circumstantial evidence is substantial and growing as our technology for exploring the ocean and analyzing genetics improves. Modern oceanography is only just beginning to properly survey the Pacific seafloor. The vast majority of it remains unmapped at high resolution. We're discovering new seamounts, plateaus, and features constantly. Some of these features have characteristics that make them candidates for former landmasses. Genetic databases are expanding, giving us more complete pictures of human migration patterns and population mixing. Satellite technology is revealing gravitational and topographical anomalies we didn't know existed. Every year, we get closer to being able to definitively say whether Mu existed, or whether it's just a compelling myth that happens to align with various pieces of evidence. What we're looking at is potentially the rewriting of human history. If Mu existed, if it was destroyed in a global catastrophe 12,000 years ago, if its survivors carried advanced knowledge to various parts of the world, then our entire understanding of human development needs to be revised. We'd have to acknowledge that human civilization is much older than we thought, that advanced societies existed and were destroyed before the rise of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that many of the achievements we attribute to gradual independent development might actually be fragments of knowledge from a lost mother civilization. Whether the academic world is ready to accept this possibility is another question entirely. Careers are built on existing paradigms. Textbooks would need to be rewritten. Long-held theories would need to be abandoned or significantly modified. It's easier to dismiss the evidence, to say that Mu is just a myth, to continue with the comfortable narrative of gradual human progress from primitive to advanced. But evidence doesn't care about comfort or convenience. It just accumulates piece by piece, challenging us to either explain it away or reconsider what we think we know. The story of Mu, whether it's ultimately proven true or remains an intriguing hypothesis, forces us to ask important questions about human history. How much do we really know about the ancient world? What evidence might be hidden under miles of ocean water? What knowledge might have been lost in ancient catastrophes? Are we really the first advanced civilization on this planet, or are we just the latest? These questions matter because they shape how we understand ourselves and our place in history. And increasingly, the evidence suggests that the answers might be more complex and fascinating than we ever imagined. But hey, that's what makes this whole field of study so addictive. There's always one more piece of evidence, one more connection, one more reason to question everything we thought we knew about where we came from and how we got here.